So now that you have an idea about eco-anxiety and the way climate change is progressing, we just want to go into a bit more detail about the impact of climate change, particular to India. So the question is, what impact does climate change have on India?
This is a very good and very important question. So I recently read a study that projected that India is the country that is the sixth most vulnerable in the world to climate change because of its geography, its infrastructure, and various other factors. Right. So what are these impacts that climate change is going to have on India? Let's start with the economic side. If India were to deal with climate change at the scale that is required, then over the next 50 years, the Indian economy is going to gain $11 trillion in GDP value just because it has made that effort to deal with climate change. This is besides all the downstream impact of this. At the same time, if India does not take action on climate change, not only do we not gain the 11 trillion, we lose $35 trillion. India's economic potential goes down by 5.5% every year because of climate change. So what does this mean on a personal level, right? The broader economic stats, yes, it makes it harder to pull people out of poverty. It makes people's lives harder. But on a personal level, it's also going to mean if you live in a coastal city, then there are chances that sea level rise could make your city unlivable. Potentially hundreds of millions of people in the worst case scenario might need to migrate from where they are just because of the proximity to sea levels. The population centers in India tend to congregate around the coasts. The interior is also populated, but that is mostly in the Gangetic belt. Right? Besides that region, the interior is not nearly as densely populated, especially in the south, in the peninsula, right? So you have big cities like Chennai, Cochin, Mumbai. All these cities are on the coasts. And as the sea level rises, at least parts of these cities will be underwater unless a lot of climate mitigation and adaptation is done so that these cities can be kept livable. But that is going to require massive, unprecedented infrastructure investment. So we're yet to see that happening. But sea level rise is a big problem. The other issue is heat waves. So there's this concept called a wet bulb temperature. That is not, in today's climate in the world, that does not exceed 31 degrees Celsius anywhere, or very rarely does.
Wait, I have a question. So
sure.
Before you proceed, so what does wet bulb temperature actually mean?
So it is the temperature of, actually, let me look that up so I can give you the proper definition.
Because it sounds really interesting.
Right. So it's the temperature read by a thermometer covered in water-soaked cloth over which air is passed. So at 100% relative humidity, the wet bulb temperature is equal to the air temperature. Where the humidity is lower, the wet bulb temperature is lower.
Okay.
So for the human body to feel comfortable, the wet bulb temperature should not exceed 31, which is what it currently doesn't exceed that very often. About 2% of India's population is exposed to wet bulb temperatures of 32 in a year at this point in time. But if current trends continue, then by later this century, 70% of India's population will be regularly exposed to those kind of temperatures. And for some small percentage of Indian population, it could go up to 35 degrees. So what that's going to lead to is severe increases in heat wave deaths. Even now you see statistics of in 2015 there was a massive heat wave and some 3,500 people died in the Indian subcontinent, I mean including Pakistan and all here. Those numbers are going to exponentially increase unless we take drastic action to mitigate this issue, and it is still possible to do that. This future is not yet set in stone, but our current trajectory is leading us there. So heat waves, go on.
Yeah. So the number 3,500. So that was in the Indian subcontinent, and was that for 1 year or like a cumulative
2015.
5-year period? 2015.
2015.
Okay. Okay. So another point to note, remember, is the fact that, so if you look at the whole population of Indian subcontinent, it's large. So you may be thinking, wait, it's 3,500. Doesn't seem like much in the larger population scheme. But the thing is, the important point to note is the government has an incentive to underreport these deaths. So by saying that there is a heat wave, and by accepting that a lot of people are dying of heat waves, means they have to allocate funds by saying it's a disaster. So when a cyclone happens, it probably attacks a city or a place for 1 or 2 days. So the disaster management fund covers the funding required to help those people get back to normalcy. But when it comes to heat waves, it can go on for up to 15 days. So 15 times the number of people impacted or the cumulative effects. So the government is underreporting these deaths because they have an incentive to do so. The less deaths they do, the less funding that they can keep for themselves and not get to the right people in need. So that 3,500 number may seem small, but it's actually much larger, maybe even 10 times larger, because they don't want to give out the right data.
Right.
Like a lot of surveys. Yeah.
That makes sense. It's also in India a question of capacity to count deaths, because not all deaths are registered and not all births are registered. So, hopefully that capacity will improve over time. But this is a serious issue. Thanks for bringing that up. Anyway, so we've talked about sea level rise. We've talked about heat waves. The next issue is air pollution, which everyone in India faces, but especially in the bigger cities. Across India, air pollution reduces life expectancy by 2 years in 2019. But in the biggest cities, it reduces life expectancy by as much as 6 years. It increases the chances of diabetes, of strokes, of heart disease, of some forms of cancer. So all of these are going to be painful deaths, and this increases the chances of that. It is very bad for pregnant women, it's bad for infants, it's bad for the elderly. So air pollution is a huge issue in India, and it is an issue that can be dealt with quite rapidly compared to something like heat waves. The problem of air pollution could be resolved within a couple of decades if the political will exists. So this is something that really needs to be dealt with and needs to become an issue that people demand governments to take action on. Right. So that's the next issue. The other one is deforestation and loss of habitat. So what happens when deforestation happens is that many species lose their habitat, and there's something called an insect apocalypse that's going on, where many insects, their populations are rapidly dying out. And a lot of people might think, hey, that's a good thing. But it's not, because they form a crucial part of the food web. And if that is disrupted, then everything from pollination to cultivation of plants and all kinds of things will get affected. And that disruption in itself will have a massive financial impact as well in terms of people's food security, all these different things. Then there's the impact of climate change on soil quality, which is going to affect Indian agriculture. It's already affecting Indian agriculture. We're already seeing how cropping patterns have shifted, and how we're requiring more and more irrigation and fertilizers to get the same crop yields that we used to get before. And that impact is going to be massive on a largely agrarian economy like India, where a vast majority of the population still depends on agriculture for their sustenance. And in terms of food security, which India has, I think, something like 25 lakh people dying of hunger every year. So we cannot isolate issues of food security and things like that from the climate impact. No matter how important climate change is, we have to deal with it in such a way that we're also not compromising on people's economic and food security, right? So that's a very, very difficult challenge to tackle, not impossible, but a difficult challenge, and one that requires immense political will. What other
Right.
impacts can you think of?
Yeah, I'd like to play the devil's advocate here, because a common person looking at all this might say, you know what, look at your US and Europe. Those
Right.
guys are spending 30%. Those guys are contributing 30% of global emissions. And you've got China at around 14% around those low tens level, contributing the CO2 emissions. So you've got North America doing a bulk of the emissions, and then you've got
You're talking
India.
about historical emissions, right?
I guess
because currently China is highest at 28, but historically US is highest.
Okay. So you've got the 20 plus countries. Let's just call that the elite club.
Right.
So you've got China, maybe you've got definitely the US, and then maybe another country approaching that 20 plus mark. And where is India at? I don't know right now. Is it
about 7%? So we should also look at it 7%. As per capita, right? Because India has a very large population to service.
So the 7% takes into account the per capita emissions.
No, it doesn't.
Right? So that
it doesn't take into account the per capita. 7% is as a country, we contribute 7% to global emissions, but we have 17% of the world's population.
So per capita, it's even much lower.
Per capita, especially if you look at it historically, our emissions are about 1/6 as high as the US.
Right. So someone looking at this video might just say, you know what, the US has contributed so much to global warming. Well, let them make the first move and let them fix their issues. Then the world's going to be fine. Like India doesn't have to do anything because it's 1/6 and it's not going to make much of an impact, right? So that's going to be the thinking process of people watching this video, maybe.
I think India does have to, because at this moment, India is the third biggest emitter in the world. After China and the US, India is the third. So we have a problem at our doorstep. We can say that somebody else caused it, but we cannot ignore it. So, but in international climate negotiations, there's a legal concept called common but differentiated responsibilities. So not all countries are required to make the same extent of sacrifices to mitigate climate change. There's discussions
and it's
right
voluntary,
now.
Right? No one's
it's voluntary.
Hold you to it if you don't do it. Right?
Right.
Yeah.
At this stage, it's voluntary because you cannot get a treaty like this, legally binding treaty, through the US Senate. So largely because of that, it's a voluntary agreement. But there are negotiations going on right now. The UN Climate Summit is going to start, I think, tomorrow or day after, something like that, after the G20. So there's going to be discussions on climate transition financing, on technology transfer, on different countries, like how they're going to cut down on coal funding, and coal is the most polluting fuel, right? So coal funding, what they're going to do to cut down on their emissions, whether that means a carbon tax or a clean emissions standard or some other sort of grants and incentives for clean energy. Are they going to cut down on subsidies for fossil fuels? So there's a lot of these discussions going on, and the next couple of weeks are going to be really crucial in that. So I would ask everyone watching this video to follow the UN Climate Summit happening right now in Glasgow, where all the major countries are going to make announcements. The US is just coming up with a bill to invest about $550 billion in climate change initiatives. The bill might pass next week. It looks like it will. China will likely come up with new plans to try and limit its emissions sooner than it has currently committed to. A couple of months ago, China promised to stop coal financing abroad. China was the largest coal financier in the world. So a lot of interesting things are happening. India might announce some interesting targets going forward.
Right.
So we should check out what's happening in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, and that's going to be our next video. So how is India going to face this challenge that's ahead, and get into a bit more detail on what they're doing currently.
Fantastic.
All right. Yeah, I'll see you guys tomorrow.
Oh, you're still here? Well, thanks for getting to the end of the video. Hey, while you're still here, make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to get new updates when we post videos. Also, make sure to check out these equally exciting videos as well. Have you pressed it yet? Come on, you have 5 seconds left. 3, 2, press it now.